Back in the spring of 1873, I signed on with the U.S. Army at Yankton, South Dakota. April 13th, to be exact. They put me in Company H of the 7th Cavalry, and before long we were headed west, 500 miles to Fort Abraham Lincoln. That place became our base of operations, and not long after, we joined what they called the Yellowstone Expedition, a summer campaign aimed at pushing deeper into the northern plains. August 4th, that same year, brought our first hard brush with danger. We were near the Yellowstone River in Montana Territory when we ran into hostiles. A quick, sharp fight broke out. 2 civilians with us didn't make it, Dr. Honsinger, our vet, and Mr. Ballyran, the civilian storekeeper. Both men had wandered a little too far off from the main group, curious about the wildflowers and strange plants in that part of the country. Their curiosity cost them their lives. A couple years later, while we were wintered at Fort Lincoln in 1874, news came in that lit a fire under General Custer. A scout reported that a Sioux warrior named Rain in the Face had been boasting at the Standing Rock Agency, some 75 miles from us, that he was the one who killed Honsinger and Ballyran. That didn't sit well with the general. Without wasting time, he ordered Captain Tom Custer, his brother, to lead a detachment of 50 men and bring the man in. I was part of that group. We rode out to Standing Rock and arrived just as the Sioux were gathering to receive their rations. The place was thick with Indians. None of us could pick Rain in the Face out of a lineup, but a local scout gave us a description and told us he'd just gone into the sutler's store. Captain Tom didn't hesitate. He walked straight in with a couple of us close behind. There stood Rain in the Face at the counter, about to buy something. Tom grabbed him on the spot. That moment caused a ripple of unrest among the Sioux outside, but the tension didn't break into violence. We got Rain in the Face out of there and hauled him back to Fort Lincoln, where he was locked up on murder charges. But the story doesn't end there. While in the guardhouse, Rain in the Face struck up an unlikely friendship with one of our own, a private doing time for some minor offense. That soldier, for reasons of his own, showed Rain in the Face small kindnesses, smuggled in tobacco, shared a bit of killikinnick, and treated him with an odd sort of respect. That friendship may have helped open a door. Not long after, 2 civilian prisoners busted out of the same jail. Rain in the Face used the distraction to slip away too. He vanished into the plains and found his way to Sitting Bull's camp, where the Sioux and their allies were gathering strength. It was early 1876 when preparations began at Fort Abraham Lincoln for what would become one of the most talked-about campaigns in U.S. military history. The operation, called the Yellowstone and Bighorn Expedition, was under the leadership of General George Armstrong Custer, and I was riding with Company H of the 7th Cavalry. We left Fort Lincoln and made the long haul, about 500 miles, to the Powder River country. That's where we set up camp for a time. While we were stationed there, Major Reno took 6 companies out on a scouting mission. It wasn't long before he came upon a wide, fresh trail, signs of a large band of Indians on the move. Reno turned back fast to report what he found to General Alfred Terry, who had overall command of the campaign. June 22 came, and General Terry ordered a pack train assembled. 2 men were chosen from each company. I was one of them, serving under Captain McDougall. We loaded up the mules that morning, broke camp at midday, and moved out. That day we made about 12 miles before setting up camp again by late afternoon. The following day, June 23, we were up early and back on the march. We covered over 30 miles in tough country. On the 24th, we pushed another 28 miles. That night, everything went quiet. No fires, no bugle calls. We all knew something serious was brewing. That same night, Captain Tom Custer, Captain McDougall, a seasoned civilian scout named Charlie Reynolds, and a half-Sioux scout who'd switched sides from the hostiles, made their way to reconnoiter the Indian encampment. When they returned, the story spread through the ranks like wildfire. The scout, Mitch Bouillet was his name, had reportedly warned General Custer not to go in. He'd seen the sheer size of the camp and knew it wasn't a fair fight. But the tale went that Custer brushed him off, called him yellow, and made up his mind to move forward. Bouillet stayed with Custer's column that next morning. None of them came back. I still remember the morning of June 25, clear as day. The bugle finally sounded again. It was the first call we'd heard in days. Officers' call. They gathered around Custer for orders, and while I couldn't hear what was said, I'll never forget the moment. There was something electric in the air. Custer looked every inch the officer and leader we admired, tall, calm, focused. We all felt it. That man could inspire like no one else. He split the regiment into 3 wings. Custer took 5 companies, C, E, F, I, and L, along with his staff and the band. Reno was given A, G, and M. The last 3, D, H, and K, were put under Captain Frederick Benteen, who was also brevetted as a colonel. Then it happened. Custer led the charge, moving out ahead with his battalion. As he rode past the rest of us, he took off his hat and raised it high. "Follow me, boys," he called out, "and we'll sleep on robes tonight." The men cheered, and for a moment, it felt like victory was just around the bend. Benteen's men followed, then Reno brought up the rear. The Indian village lay tucked along the far bank of the Little Bighorn River, where the woods thinned out into open ground. Behind it, a ridge ran for miles, jagged and steep. That bluff followed the river like a shadow, too rough and broken for cavalry to cross except at a few narrow spots. The ground itself decided how the battle would unfold. From the point where General Custer split the regiment, he aimed to circle down about 7 miles and strike the village from its lower end, coming up from behind, or so the plan went. But as his column came into view along the final stretch, about a mile from the village, every eye in the Indian camp could see them coming. That warning gave the warriors plenty of time to rally, and they did. I believe the real fight hit just as Custer's men tried to force the river. You could tell by where we later found the horses, many of them lying dead in the water, never having made it across. That tells me the unit took heavy fire right in the ford. Whatever order there was must have crumbled fast. The survivors likely pulled back up the hill in a hurry, only about 300 yards, but even that short ground was littered with bodies. You'd see one here, then a cluster of 5 or 6. It was chaos. The final stand happened on a bald, yellow rise, no trees, no cover. There we found what was left. They'd made a ring out of their own horses, killing them for a makeshift barricade. Inside that grim circle lay General Custer, along with his brother Tom, his other brother Boston, who'd been serving as forage master, and adjutant cook. Custer had 2 clear wounds, one through the chest, another at the temple. The head wound still bled when we arrived, blood trailing down his face, soaking his mustache and mouth. That kind of bleeding only happens if the heart's still pumping. In other words, he was still alive, at least for a moment, after he was hit in the head. That says a lot. Maybe too much. You have to wonder, was that final shot mercy? Did one of his own put him out before the Sioux could take him alive? It wouldn't be the first time a battlefield demanded such a choice. His body wasn't mutilated, just a cut across one leg. He was stripped down to his socks. That was unusual. Most of the others were badly handled, scalped, cut, torn. Captain Tom Custer, especially, hard to even identify. Cook, too. He had those thick side whiskers, and even those were taken. The Cheyenne knew what they were doing. But one body stood apart. Just one man wasn't touched, not scalped, not cut. His coat had been taken off and laid gently across his face, like someone was shielding him from the sun. We recognized him. He'd once been locked up with rain in the face back at Fort Abraham Lincoln, treated the chief with kindness. Shared tobacco, gave him a bit of dignity in a place where that was in short supply. I believe rain in the face found him and spared him out of memory and respect. maybe even gratitude. I believe if that Sioux warrior had seen him alive that day, he might have let him go. When the dust settled on that bloody afternoon, 5 full companies of the 7th Cavalry had been wiped out, nearly every last man gone. Only a couple of souls escaped what was clearly a one-sided slaughter. That evening, around 9 o'clock, a Crow scout came into Benteen's lines, raising a commotion. At the time, folks believed it was Curly, but later accounts suggest it was probably another scout named Goes Ahead. Curly had actually watched the disaster unfold from a high ridge, then slipped away, eventually reaching the steamboat far west on the Yellowstone to spread word of the catastrophe. When the scout arrived, we hoped, maybe prayed, he had some word from Custer. But through the interpreters, it became clear he didn't know any more than we did. Most of us figured he hadn't even been in the fight. Probably took off when the first shots rang out. Another man who didn't perish was John Martin, Custer's bugler. He'd been sent back with a message for Benteen before the real killing started. He said that when he left, the Indians were already in view. Along with Martin and the scout, a handful of other troopers, Peter Thompson, James Watson, John Brennan, and John Fitzgerald, managed to survive, but none had a front-row seat to what happened next. Based on what I saw later, I'd put Custer's final moments around mid-afternoon, maybe 2 or 3 o'clock. Not long after that, we saw warriors wearing our uniforms, even blowing our brass band instruments, taunting us from the ridges. That was hard to watch. It made it clear, our boys were gone. The attackers weren't even on horseback. I only saw one dead pony on the whole field, which told me they'd fought on foot, maybe to keep quiet, maybe to fight better in close quarters. The battlefield itself was a mess. No sign of organized resistance. The bodies weren't in formations, just scattered like leaves in a windstorm. Any sense of command and control had broken down fast. These men didn't go down in tight ranks, they were picked off piecemeal, likely running or making a last stand wherever they could. It wasn't a fair fight, and they never had a chance. One image stays with me, a line of dead troopers, maybe 30 in all, stripped, mutilated, left on display. Looked like the women had arranged them deliberately, maybe out of spite or for ceremony. Indian children had driven arrows into the corpses, likely after the battle was over. On the morning of June 25, when the bugle sounded to signal the officer's call, Major Reno's men began their march. Their destination was a ford on the far side of the village, located about 5 miles away. Reno was supposed to reach it at nearly the same time as Custer, who was expected to cross at the opposite end of the village. Once they reached the river, the crossing went without incident. From there, the soldiers charged across a wide stretch of open land, roughly 400 to 500 yards, heading toward the forest where the Indians were lying in wait. As soon as they entered the woods, the ambush hit like a thunderclap. A hail of gunfire erupted from all sides, knocking the horses into a panicked frenzy, sending them rearing and bucking backward in chaos. Reno, quick to act, ordered the men to dismount. Then came a second volley, even more vicious than the first. Reno, trying to maintain some order amidst the mayhem, told the men to remount. But by then, confusion had completely overtaken them, and the situation quickly spiraled out of control. The order to "save yourselves" rang out. Now, it was every man for himself. The line between soldier and Indian blurred as the two forces mixed together in a brutal melee. The troopers were dragged from their horses, their cries and struggles lost in the whirlwind of battle. Some were bound to trees in the heart of the village, where they would be burned alive that night, their screams echoing across the field, a sight that would haunt their comrades, men like Benteen's division, who could do nothing to save them. Meanwhile, Benteen's battalion was moving in. They had a shorter distance to cover than the other 2 battalions, and as a result, they were able to bring up the pack train that had been positioned a mile or so to the rear. The sight that met them was a grim one. Reno's men, who had been driven into that hellish ambush, had barely managed to survive, and those few who did make it out made their way across the river to Benteen's position. Had it not been for Benteen's timely arrival, it's likely that Reno's battalion would have met the same fate as Custer's. I was still at the rear with the pack train, around a mile from Benteen's position. We were under orders to join them after a delay of about an hour. Captain McDougall briefed us on the situation, telling us we might need to form a separate company if we arrived to find a battle already underway. When we finally reached Benteen's men, the fighting had momentarily stalled. I decided to take a ride up to a rise in the ground to get a better look at the situation. Just as I did, Captain Benteen called out, "Rein in that horse, Adams. You'll get yourself killed." I reined in and, to my shock, saw the ground ahead of me crawling with Indians. They were lying in wait, just over the hilltop. It was around 1 o'clock when we made contact with Benteen, and by then, the sound of gunfire from Custer's position had faded, replaced by a tense silence. We held a brief council of officers, then set out to find Custer. We moved east, heading right toward where the firing had been coming from, no more than half a mile. As we crested a ridge, which looked like a railroad grade, we were met with the horrifying sight of thousands of Indians, lying in wait for us just over the rise. Benteen, realizing the odds were stacked against us, immediately ordered a retreat. It was a wise decision. We fell back to a stronger position, one that had a better defensive layout. This all happened between 2 and 3 o'clock, and by then, the firing from the right had stopped. One company was assigned to cover our retreat. But as soon as the Indians caught wind of our withdrawal, they surged forward from all sides, forcing the company to pull back in a hasty retreat. From that point on, the battle raged without pause. The fighting was relentless, stretching on until around 8 o'clock that night. This was the first time I had been under such fire, and it was something I'll never forget. By 5 o'clock, most of the men who were near me had already fallen, either dead or grievously wounded. One of my closest comrades, George Lell, had taken a fatal hit. His voice was weak as he asked for water, a request echoed by every wounded man around me. We had no choice but to try and bring them water. Captain McDougall called for volunteers, and, still unharmed, I stepped forward. A few of us grabbed our camp kettles and headed for the river, using a small ravine for cover. The ravine led us down to a little open patch of land, about 30 yards across, directly opposite the same woods where Reno's men had been decimated earlier in the day. The Indians were still lurking in those woods, and we knew every step would be perilous. One by one, we made the dash across the open ground, scooped water from the river, and ran back to shelter. But when my turn came, disaster struck. Just as I was about to head back into the ravine with my kettle of water, I felt a sharp jolt. Upon inspection, I realized a bullet had punctured my kettle. Frustration welled up, but I had no time to waste. I grabbed a new kettle and went back for a second round. By the time I returned, the wounded men were desperate for the water. George Lell, poor soul, was still hanging on, and though I could see the end was near, I watched with a heavy heart as he took a long drink. He died a few hours later, around 10 o'clock, but at least I knew I had done what I could to ease his suffering in those final moments. The night of June 25 slipped by in uneasy quiet after the shooting died down around 8. We hunkered low, listening, watching the ridgelines above us. Then, just before dawn on the 26th, around 4 o'clock, we spotted movement. A group of warriors, silhouettes against the early sky, creeping along the high ground. We opened fire. In an instant, the whole ridgeline erupted. The fighting roared back to life. From that moment until mid-morning, it was a pitched, relentless battle. The Lakota and Cheyenne came at us with a kind of fury that's hard to describe. Waves of them, determined and unyielding. By 9 o'clock, it felt like we were at the breaking point. But Captain Benteen ordered a charge. We surged forward. What followed was brutal, close combat, hand to hand. You could hear the clash of rifle stocks and the thud of fists. But that bold move forced the enemy to pull back. We dropped back as well, just over the crest of the ridge, waiting for what came next. It was during that withdrawal that I lost a good man, my tent mate, Tom Meadows from West Virginia. He caught a bullet in the chest. I tried to drag him back, but another shot struck him in the head. He died there in my arms. As I turned to run for cover, I glanced back, and there was an Indian stepping toward Tom's body, holding a feathered staff like some sort of trophy. Something inside me snapped. I fired. That man never took another step. By late afternoon, the gunfire thinned out. We could see the enemy pulling back, packing up. They weren't in a hurry, but they were definitely on the move. There were a few scattered shots as the sun dropped, but nothing serious. We didn't pay them much mind at that point. Our position was a strange one, down in a bowl-shaped depression, like a giant wash basin. Our horses were clustered in the center, while we held the rim. That's where we dug in, facing outward in every direction. The enemy had us surrounded. Company H, my outfit, took the worst of it. We had one shovel, just one. As night fell, we used it to scrape out shallow breastworks in the rocky soil. None of us believed it was over. We figured they were just moving their women and children out of the way before finishing the job at dawn. But they never came back. General Terry was closing in, and their scouts must have caught wind of it. At first light on the 27th, help arrived. General Terry and General Gibbon came in from across the river, heading straight through the remnants of the Indian camp. They passed close, within a few hundred yards of where Custer's men had fallen, but they didn't spot the bodies. As they reached us, our boys cheered and waved their hats. But Terry, tough old soldier that he was, couldn't keep it together. When he tried to speak, his voice broke. He just stood there, silent, overcome. Until that moment, none of us knew what had become of Custer and the men with him. After tending to our wounded and moving them across the river, a small group from what remained of the 7th Cavalry rode out under Benteen and Reno. We aimed for the last place we'd seen Custer. We fanned out, combing the bluffs. Before long, we found the bodies. I'd ridden a bit ahead, following the river. That's when I spotted a low rise dotted with dead horses, white ones. I approached and saw the fallen body of General George Armstrong Custer. I flagged Benteen. He rode up, took one look, and said quietly, "That surely is General Custer." We all gathered there, but no one had much to say. What could you say? Amid the carnage, only one living thing remained, Comanche, the favorite horse of Captain Keogh. He was wounded and sitting upright, front legs braced on the ground. As we neared, he gave a faint whinny. A few of us dismounted and helped him up. We left him grazing as best he could. That same evening, riddled with bullets but still alive, Comanche made it into camp. He was later sent east, where he would become a symbol of the fallen command. We buried the dead where we could, marking the graves as best as circumstances allowed. Every officer who rode with Custer was laid to rest. But war doesn't care much for neat endings. 2 years later, I returned to that battlefield. I found bones bleached by sun and wind, some dug up by wolves, scattered by coyotes. The prairie had reclaimed its silence, but the echoes of what happened there hadn't gone anywhere.